Welcome back to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're looking at a topic that completely changes how we view American history. You know, when we think about the end of the American Civil War, most of us picture a very specific, almost cinematic moment in time. Two generals sitting in a parlor, you've got Ulysses S. Grant executing his masterful strategy as general-in-chief to finally end the bloodshed, and Robert E. Lee conceding defeat. A quick stroke of a pen, a handshake, and boom, the nation is instantly reunited. But history is rarely that clean or that simple. Today, we're exploring the true, incredibly drawn-out, and dramatic conclusion of the Civil War. We're talking rogue generals, lingering battles, massive cavalry raids, and a fleeing president on the run.
Okay, let's dive into this. Did the Civil War actually end at Appomattox Court House on April 9, 1865? It's the standard high school history myth we've all been taught, right? We learned all about General Grant's brilliant leadership, how during that final year of the war, he operated as general-in-chief, executing this relentless strategy of annihilation that cornered Lee and forced him into that parlor. And of course, we learn about the incredibly magnanimous, generous terms Grant offered to start healing the nation right then and there. It's a beautiful, tidy ending. But actually, that iconic handshake was literally just the beginning of the end. The war was far from over.
Which brings us to Section 1, the myth of Appomattox.
We really need to reframe how we look at General Lee's surrender. Yes, Grant's victory over the premier Confederate Army of Northern Virginia signaled that the ultimate end was in sight, and his Appomattox terms absolutely set the gold standard for all succeeding surrenders. But Lee's surrender was just the first domino to fall. There were still massive Confederate armies out in the field, fully armed and ready to fight. Let's look at this number, 90,000. That is the number of Confederate troops operating across the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida right then under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston. While Lee was surrendering in Virginia, Johnston was still actively maneuvering against Union General William T. Sherman's forces down in North Carolina. This wasn't some minor ragtag skirmish force. This was a massive, lethal army, still very much a threat.
And the threat certainly didn't stop there. Add another 40,000 troops to that tally. Those were men under Confederate Lieutenant General Richard Taylor, who were still active and holding territory in the Deep South, specifically across Mississippi, Alabama, and East Louisiana. So right off the bat, you've got well over 100,000 Confederate soldiers who haven't surrendered a single musket yet.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because April 1865 was an absolute whirlwind of chaos. On April 9th, Lee surrenders, but just 5 days later, on April 14th, President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated at Ford's Theater. This completely, violently shatters the political landscape. Overnight, the mood in Washington flips from Grant's vision of conciliation straight to vengeance. It left everyone wondering if future surrender terms would be anywhere near as lenient as what Grant had offered Lee. And it isn't until April 26th, after weeks of really tense back and forth, that General Johnston finally surrenders to Sherman.
So let's look at how that happened in Section 2, the Bennett Place negotiations.
This right here is where the military reality and the political reality violently crash into one another. Sherman and Johnston were trying to figure out how to end the war for these remaining troops, but they were doing it under the incredibly dark, heavy shadow of Lincoln's assassination. This is the Bennett Place farmhouse near Durham, North Carolina. It looks like a humble, quiet little farm, doesn't it? But this exact spot was actually the site of the largest troop surrender of the entire American Civil War. Nearly 90,000 troops laid down their arms because of the meetings inside that tiny wooden structure. But man, getting to that final signature was a total political nightmare.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast between Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman. Grant's terms at Appomattox really showcased his brilliant vision as general-in-chief. They were strictly military, highly magnanimous, and designed to immediately heal the fractured nation. He paroled the soldiers, let them keep their horses, and just sent them home. Sherman, on the other hand, he went way out of his depth. In his first agreement with Johnston, Sherman included these overly generous political terms, essentially recognizing Southern state governments, reestablishing federal courts, and effectively guaranteeing a blanket amnesty that could have pardoned Confederate President Jefferson Davis himself. No way was Washington going to accept that. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was furious, completely rejected the terms, and actually ordered General Grant to go down to North Carolina and take control. Grant, showing incredible tact, actually let Sherman fix his own mistake, and together they eventually forced Johnston to accept those strictly military, Appomattox-style terms.
So, as we push into May, we see this rapid cascade of Confederate infrastructure just collapsing. On May 4th, General Richard Taylor finally surrenders his 40,000 troops in Alabama.
The very next day, May 5th, the fleeing Confederate government officially dissolves in Washington, Georgia. And by May 10th, Confederate President Jefferson Davis is captured. The dominoes are falling fast now, right?
But let's step back a second for Section 3, Raids and Lingering Battles.
Because it is absolutely crucial to remember that while Sherman and Johnston were sitting in that farmhouse, drinking whiskey and debating legal terms, soldiers were still fighting, bleeding, and dying out in the field. News traveled so slowly back then, and military operations set in motion weeks earlier were still violently playing out. Take a look at Union General Edward Canby and Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. They perfectly represent the fierce opposing forces still clashing in the Deep South. While peace was being brokered out east, Canby was launching massive assaults on the Gulf Coast, and Union cavalry was relentlessly hunting down Forrest's legendary Confederate horsemen in Alabama, eventually routing them at places like Ebenezer Church.
Let's break down the sheer scale of this lingering devastation. You had Union General James H. Wilson leading a massive 13,000-man cavalry raid, armed with these devastating 7-shot repeating carbines, literally tearing through the industrial heart of Alabama and Georgia. Down on the coast, General Canby launched a 16,000-troop assault on the heavily fortified defenses of Mobile, Alabama, navigating swamps and deadly underwater mines. Over in Georgia, Union forces captured Fort Tyler, which actually resulted in the death of Confederate General Robert C. Tyler, the last general officer killed in action during the whole war. And across the Carolinas, Potter's and Stoneman's raiders were still burning cotton gins, destroying railroads, and skirmishing with local militias. The war machine was still churning, completely oblivious to the peace talks.
This takes us to Section 4, Capturing Jefferson Davis.
With the military forces disintegrating, the Union's priority shifted to a massive manhunt. They knew they needed to cut the head of the snake to ensure the Confederacy couldn't rise again as some sort of long-term guerrilla insurgency. And this brilliantly illustrates the immense disconnect at the very end of the war. Even after Lee surrendered to Grant, even after Richmond fell, Confederate President Jefferson Davis maintained this incredible, delusional hope. When he met with his generals, he actually pitched a wild scheme to raise a massive new field army by recalling deserters. His generals, the guys who had been fighting the actual battles, knew it was completely over. They told him flat out, "The troops will not fight anymore. Our only goal now is to get you to safety."
Let's quickly trace his desperate flight. Step 1. Davis and his cabinet flee Richmond by train, heading to Danville, Virginia. Step 2. Union cavalry is actively destroying the rail lines ahead of him, so he's forced onto horseback. He eventually holds his final, grim council of war in Abbeville, South Carolina, where his commanders finally force him to accept the cause as lost. Step 3. Pushing deep into Georgia, convinced he's finally ahead of his pursuers, his camp at Irwinville is suddenly surrounded. In the early morning hours of May 10th, the 1st Wisconsin and 4th Michigan Cavalry Regiments captured Davis, reportedly as he was trying to slip away wearing his wife's shawl. A pretty surprising end for the Confederate president.
Section 5, Final Confederate Surrenders.
So even with Davis in custody, stretching into the summer and fall of 1865, the sheer geographic vastness of the divided nation meant the conflict dragged on in the furthest reaches of the continent and even across the globe. On June 2nd, General Kirby Smith officially surrenders the massive Trans-Mississippi Department, though honestly, his army had mostly deserted by then. On June 19th, Union troops finally arrive in Galveston, Texas, enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation and freeing over 250,000 enslaved people. That's the day we now celebrate as Juneteenth. And incredibly, the final Confederate unit doesn't surrender until November 6, 1865. And it wasn't even in America, it was in Liverpool, England. The crew of the CSS Shenandoah, a Confederate raider ship operating in the North Pacific, only learned the war was over late in the summer and had to sail all the way to Britain just to seek asylum.
Now, contrast all of that lingering conflict with this image. This is the Grand Review of the Armies in Washington, D.C., back in May 1865. It was a massive two-day celebration where thousands of victorious Union soldiers marched down Pennsylvania Avenue past the White House. The North was throwing this huge victory parade, cheering for Grant and Sherman. But the juxtaposition is just striking, isn't it? While the crowds cheered in Washington, the grim reality was that the war was still actively winding down in the South, and the brutal, complicated reality of Reconstruction was just beginning.
Finally, Section 6, Official Declaration of Peace.
We've looked at the military surrenders, the manhunts, the captured leaders. But when did the war actually, legally, end in the eyes of the United States government? Believe it or not, it wasn't until August 20th, 1866. President Andrew Johnson formally proclaimed peace
order, tranquility, and civil authority now exists in and throughout the whole of the United States of America. By signing that proclamation, Johnson officially and legally ended the Civil War. That is a full 16 months after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox. 16 months of political maneuvering, scattered violence, and national uncertainty.
So the crucial point I want to leave you with is this. How do we truly define the end of a war? Is it the moment the most famous general surrenders? Is it when the politicians are captured? Or is it when the final ship lowers its flag half a world away? Ending a massive conflict is always a messy, prolonged, and deeply complicated process. It's like a giant puzzle, and it is never just a single signature on a document. I really hope this deep dive has challenged your perspective and left you wanting to explore more about this incredible, chaotic period in our history. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.